everybody, and welcome back to our videos about the English literature. In this period in particular, we're talking about fiction, about novels during the Victorian age or Victorian era, if you prefer. And today we are going to talk specifically about one of the most representative novels of the time, and his name is Robert Louis Stevenson. Okay, Stevenson was born in 1850. And he wasn't English. He was a Scotman. He was born in Edinburgh, and we can say that he was extremely fascinated by Scottish landscapes and atmospheres and landscapes, and we find all of that in his works. Probably we could even say that he continued Walter Scott's tradition as far as Scottish literature is concerned. He was born in a very conservative household. He received a very conservative, a very strict education in a Calvinist family, and very soon he rebelled against this education, against this family, against this social pattern. When we talk about the Victorian era, we often say that it was based on the strict moral code, on this patriarchal family, which followed a very strict social pattern and was based on conventions and appearances. Okay, Stevenson's family belonged to this period completely. But he didn't. So he rebelled against this pattern. He started to study law, and then he started a very bohemian life, okay, a very particular lifestyle. And he criticized the we can say the hypocrisy of the middle class, which was the most important social class of the time, basically. He also became atheist, which was obviously a strong rebellion against his family and against his education. Then he married an American woman, an American divorced woman, and he followed her to live in America for a short period of time. Actually, it makes me smile a little, because nowadays we are talking a lot, especially in this period, about the so-called royal wedding. Okay, so Prince Harry, who has just married Meghan, who is an American girl, an American woman, who is divorced. And nowadays, in the 21st century, we are still talking about that, which is actually very surprising. We haven't been able to overcome the stereotypes, and we're still talking about this woman who is divorced, who isn't English. Oh, this is incredible. Okay, a long time has passed since then, and we are still talking about this. We should be over all of this. Okay, obviously Stevenson didn't belong to the royal family, obviously, but nowadays, okay, these conventions still belong to the royal household sometimes, or in some ways. Well, maybe now not so much as before, but we are still very interested, and we are still very surprised by these aspects, which should be very normal, okay, nowadays. Anyway, back to Stevenson. He married this woman, and he lived for some time in America. Then he came back to Scotland after a reconciliation with his father. But he lived in Scotland for a very short time, actually, because he had some health problems, and for these reasons he had to look for milder climates. And for a long period he lived in Samoa. This is very interesting, because he became sort of a legend, okay, among the native people in Samoa. And they even gave him a name, a sort of a particular name in their language, that was Tusitala. to zitala, which meant storyteller, okay, because he had this incredible talent as a storyteller, and so he received this special name, okay, from the native people there. And he was very influenced and fascinated by these exotic atmospheres and landscapes. We find many of them in one of his most famous works, which is Treasure Island, probably. But we also know that his most important, his masterpiece, his most important work, most popular work is obviously Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, but the complete title is The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. This is a very, very interesting work. This work is a sort of an exploration of the dual nature of the individual. On one side, obviously, Dr. Jekyll, he is accepted by society, he perfectly belongs to the conventions and the pattern of the Victorian society. On the other side, we have Mr. Hyde, and he is the unconscious side of the individual, the hidden side of the individual, and that's the name Hyde, which comes from the verb to hide, obviously. This unconscious part, which is a huge part actually of the individual, is so frustrated, and when it comes out, it runs out of control, it gets out of control, okay? And this is Dr. Jekyll's huge problem. When we talk about this dual nature of the individual and a scientist, in this case Dr. Jekyll, that creates this monster, he doesn't really create it, he only finds out a part of himself, but anyway, a monster comes out. So it remembers us probably of another work, and we've talked about that in one of my previous videos, and the work is Frankenstein or the Modern Prometheus by Mary Shelley. She wasn't a novelist of the Victorian age, of the Victorian era. She wrote during the early Romanticism, and her novel was a Gothic novel, so something different, but there are some points in common. This dualism inside, this dualism in human nature. And we have the scientist, in that case was Frankenstein, in this case it is Dr. Jekyll, and he sort of creates or gives life to this monster. In Dr. Jekyll's case, he doesn't create life, okay, as Frankenstein did, and we know that the problem was his, we can say his way of acting as a sort of a Prometheus, okay, and that was the challenge against God, against nature, that was punished in Frankenstein. Now it is something different, because Dr. Jekyll doesn't create life, but with his potion he only emphasizes, he only gives the opportunity to the unconscious side of himself to come out, okay, to show himself, and so he can really explore also what is under the surface in the individual. Now, these two works, Frankenstein and Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, have some aspects in common, like for example the fact that most scenes, also in Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, play at night. Okay, and also in Frankenstein we know it was a Gothic novel, so darkness was a huge part of it. In Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, it is very interesting to remember that most of the scenes are inside the house, and it's a symbol, okay, of plot that develops, or anyway a focus that is on the inner side of the individual, okay. So inside is also symbolical in this case. So we can also mention the fact that somehow Stevenson anticipated something that was actually analyzed by Sigmund Freud a long time later. Now, obviously, Sigmund Freud, so he was born in 1939, so much later, obviously. Stevenson couldn't have an idea of his medical or scientific discoveries or theories or whatever. But somehow he could can say, understand or perceive something about the individual, and he really anticipates some of the main themes that will be treated by Freud, in the next century. So, first of all, the individual is formed, according to Freud, is formed by two parts, on one side the unconscious part, which is called is. Is the personal pronoun in German, like it in English, and this is very strong, is huge, and is formed by all the unconscious or hidden side of the individual. On the other side, there is that part of the individual that is, you can say, accepted by society, is there for anybody to see, and this part is called the ego, Ich in German. And Freud says, or he represents the individual as an iceberg. As an iceberg because the part we can see, which is the ego, is just a very, very small part compared to what is beneath, under the surface, which is huge, and that is the unconscious side, so the is, And he also says that there is a sort of a small part, a small room, he says, between the ego and the is, between the conscious and the conscious side, and this part is called in German über ich, which is in English super ego. This is a sort of a filter, formed by conventions, educations, morals, we can say also religious, social convention, and so on, and this allows only small bits of the unconscious side to get, to come to the surface and to form the actual ego, to form that part of the individual that we can all see. Now, the stricter this filter, this superego is, the more our unconscious side gets frustrated, And this is extremely dangerous because when pulsions, and when unconscious sides come out, as in Mr. Hyde's case, they can easily get out of control because they haven't been processed somehow, they have been frustrated for such a long time. And this is what happens in Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. By the way, Mr. Hyde isn't a huge monster, as it is often represented, but he is small and sneaky, so he is completely different from what we normally represent or imagine, because it is actually a sneaky side of our soul, of our unconscious side, Now, getting out of control, obviously, Mr. Hyde also, we can say that he commits also crimes and homicide, and Dr. Jekyll has had to kill himself, so to commit suicide, in order to kill the other side of himself, in order to kill Mr. Hyde, to stop him. So this is also very interesting because even at the end, the two parts of the individual belong together, and they can't fight one another, they can find each other, can fight each other. Dr. Jekyll has to renounce to himself in order to follow his morals. Somehow we can say that something that Stevenson also perceived, was obviously just an intuition, it was a perception, was also pathology, psychological pathology. Freud will talk about how this unconscious side of the individual, when it is frustrated and when it is somehow hidden, it can also provoke disorders, okay, in the individual, and also pathological behaviors and disorders and whatever. And this is something that Stevenson somehow explained very well when he talked about Mr. Hyde behaving in this uncontrolled way and Dr. Jekyll having to kill himself in order to kill him, basically. Now, we can say that the idea of forces, of you can say opposite forces fighting against one another, is quite typical, is very present in Stevenson's works. Let's think about Kidnapped, for example. This is something completely different from Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. It's absolutely different because it is sort of a national epic, okay, of we can say conflicting forces after, or better, in post-Union Scotland. So this is a completely different theme. But also in this case, we have this idea, this juxtaposition of opposite forces fighting against each other. But okay, we have talked about the contents now, and what about the style? So, as we said before, Stevenson was an amazing storyteller. This is the talent that made him very popular at the time and today as well. In his works we can find both clarity on one side and suspense on the other side, and they make plots extremely interesting, especially because he doesn't focus too much on characters, but especially on action. So the plot is extremely interesting, and the reader is also very involved, okay, in the action. Stevenson also looked for some experimentations, especially in the last years of his work. In fact, we have some new styles, for example, multiple narrators and some analysis, some psychological and philosophical analysis, but he also had to follow the pattern that the Victorian era required, actually, and he absolutely managed to become one of the most popular, the most famous writers of his time. And nowadays he is still very popular because his works are absolutely universal. Okay, Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde will always be very modern, will always talk about people, will always talk about ourselves, and he really anticipates we can say the currencies that will characterize modernism in England, and we're talking about the 20th century now. In those currencies, the plot, the focus, okay, of the plot shifts, okay, from the external action to the internal side, the interior side of the individual. And this shift from the external plot to internal plot is extremely important, is the most important characteristic of modernism, basically. Now, he sort of anticipated all of it. He did it in a very unconscious way. He did it with the great and amazing talent of a great storyteller, as we said before. but he really added something completely new to literature, to the literature of his time, to the literature of the Victorian era. So, once again, I hope that what I've just told you is interesting for you. If you have any questions or any comments, please just write and leave a comment below, okay, under this video, and please subscribe my channel and share my videos if you like them, so we can get more people involved and we can work even more and even better. If you have any requests, just write me in the comments, and I hope to see you very soon. Thank you and goodbye.